Dearest friends, you're a wonderful, full, beautiful audience. For that we say Kanai Nahara. We are grateful that you are here. Welcome to Temple Emanu-El. We are thrilled you're here this evening, and we are profoundly grateful to the kind forces of the Jewish Week for having conceived of this program and eliciting the efforts of the participants, all seated happily before you. In the 35 years that I've served Temple Emanu-El, I can't count the number of times when I have been asked whether or not I believe in God. To teenagers, I usually respond, believe in God? Of course not. I believe in Mercedes-Benz. I believe the universe is one grand mechanical, impersonal, uncaring, and unfeeling machine. Young people, is that what you really want me to say to you? But to adults, I offer a different answer. To adults, I say that the ultimate theological issue that we address is not necessarily whether we believe in God. It could just as logically be the other way around. And the real question just might be, perhaps it might be, whether God believes in us. After all, whether one believes in God or not is merely an individual act of faith or of apostasy, depending upon your position. And it is really of no immediate consequence or everlasting concern. In other words, it's no real Groisa Gadilla. Do you all know what that means? Translate it. Big deal. But if for some reason God ceases to believe in you, if you have lived in such a way as to cause God to lose faith in you, then that could potentially have some very profound and eternal consequences, which means that you might ultimately get it up the gorgle, if you know what that is. How many of you know what the gorgle is? The throat. Exactly. I'd like you to think about that for a few seconds. So having expressed these hopefully tantalizing thoughts to you, and to help guide you along this challenging path, it is with pleasure that I introduce to you Rich Wolof of the Jewish Week, who will in turn introduce the evening and introduce to you our illustrious panel. We are thrilled that we are here. Dear Rich, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi. Welcome. My name, as the Rabbi mentioned, is Rich Wolof, and I'm the Associate Publisher of the Jewish Week. Let me first thank Temple Emanu-El for their generous cooperation and assistance in hosting tonight's program in the beautiful Lowenstein Auditorium. Tonight's event, Do You Believe? Conversations on God and Religion, is part of the Jewish Week's ongoing community initiative to bring special educational programs and forums to New York's Jewish community. It is our aim to extend our brand beyond the pages of our weekly newspaper and website, to bring special programs like we are having tonight to all parts of the greater metropolitan area. The Jewish Week is the nation's largest and most respected weekly newspaper written for New York's Jewish community. Our award-winning journalists present news, features, and opinion on what's happening in New York, Washington, Israel, and around the world, from a perspective not found in other print and online media sources. We publish 5 weekly editions of the Jewish Week, and our readership reflects a diversity of young and old, men and women, and of all denominations of Judaism, residing primarily in the greater New York area. So before I introduce our panelists, let me just tell everybody about some logistics for tonight. Antonio Monda will moderate a discussion on his book, Do.You.Believe? Conversations on God and Religion, recently published by Vintage Books. He will introduce our guests, Daniel Libeskind, Jonathan Safran Foer, Mary Gordon, and Gay Talese. Their discussions will last about an hour, and it will be followed by a question and answer period from you, our esteemed audience. After the program, we would like to invite everybody downstairs, either accessible through the elevator or down the steps on the side, for a dessert reception. At this reception, you will have the opportunity to purchase books written by the various authors, and they'll be happy to sign their books for you. In addition, we'll have complimentary copies of the Jewish Week available, and we hope that those of you who aren't familiar with our weekly newspaper will pick up a copy and read today's issue and get to know us a little bit better. Also available for you will be trial subscription cards for the Jewish Week, and we'll be happy to send you 8 weeks at no cost as a complimentary subscription. At this time, I'd like to quickly thank a few people involved in putting this exciting evening together. Mark Weistock and Sherry Namer of Temple Emanu-El, whose assistance was invaluable, and we thank you greatly. Danielle Newman and Russell Perot of Vintage Books, thank you. And Miriam Reinhardt of the Jewish Week, who did so much to make all this happen, handled countless details, pulled the panel together, and worked countless hours in getting an event like this together. Her thanks are especially appreciated. I'd also like to thank 2 other Jewish Week staff members, Darrell Levin, who handled reservations, and Randy Sherman, who's assisting here tonight. Now, before I introduce Antonio Monda, I'd also like to make a special thanks and express my gratitude to the Jewish Week's board for their invaluable assistance and support. So, Antonio Monda, and I'll ask him to come up in a second. I would ask you, everybody, if you haven't already shut your cell phones off, to please do so in respect for our panelists tonight. Antonio Monda teaches in the Kambar Institute of Film and Television, Tisch School of Arts, New York University. He is an award-winning filmmaker, the co-founder and artistic director of the literary festival Le Conversazione, a writer for La Repubblica, and author of A Journey into the American Cinema, and with Mary Lee Bandy, the editor of The Hidden God. Antonio has curated exhibitions and retrospectives for the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the Film Society of Lincoln Center, the National Gallery of Art, and the Rome Auditorium. He was recently written up in a New York Times book review as arguably the most well-connected New York cultural figure you've never heard of. Okay? Antonio lives in New York City with his wife and 3 children. His new book, Do.You.Believe, is a conversation on God, religion, and faith with some of the preeminent voices in American culture. Do.You.Believe raises important questions about the place of religion in the modern world, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Antonio Monda.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very long, the list of people I should thank tonight, starting from my publisher at Vintage, but of course, whoever was involved in this beautiful event, the Temple Emanu-El, and Jewish Week. You already mentioned the names of my distinguished guests, but I would like to repeat Mary Gordon on my left, Daniel Libeskind, Gay Talese, and Jonathan Safran Foer. I would like to continue this project that it is called Do You Believe? Conversation on God and Religion. I wrote this book 3 years ago, but actually started almost 7 years ago with a series of articles published for La Repubblica. At the beginning, I just published 5 articles interviewing Saul Bellow, Toni Morrison, Derek Walcott, Elie Wiesel, and Nathan Englander. And then I decided to complete this, and I started interviewing Daniel Libeskind and several others, intellectuals, artists, filmmakers, writers, asking them the basic question, the fundamental question, what I think is the fundamental question: do you believe? Either you respond yes or no. My feeling, my impression, my conviction is that everything else is consequential. And this is the first thing that I want to ask my guest. The first question is, do you believe? And the second is, whatever you might think, do you agree with me that everything else is consequential? Would you like to start, Mary?
I'd like to start by saying, if I believe, it has to include a large measure of unbelief. And I would like to quote a poem by the Polish poet Anna Kamieńska. It's called Lack of Faith. Yes, even when I don't believe, there is a place in me inaccessible to unbelief, a patch of wild grace, a stubborn preserve, impenetrable, pain untouched, sleeping in the body, music that builds its nest in silence. And so I don't want the term belief to be a univalent term, because any belief that is of any value at all includes substantial lashings of unbelief. Do I think it's the most important thing? Not at all. That would suggest that people who believe are somehow very, very different from people who don't believe. And I would say that, for example, I do believe in God, but I have a lot more in common with certain Marxists, should they still exist, than I do with evangelicals. And so the question of belief, uninflected, unexamined, is not, I think, a very useful term.
When you say that there is still in your belief a large degree of doubt, do you mean that every day? Is there any technician who can help me with this? Maybe hold it higher. Can you hear me now? Maybe it's better. Okay. My question was.
Can you hear me or no? You can't hear me at all? I think it's my scarf. Okay.
My question was about doubt. So you have a faith that is not 100% certain. You feel that there is a God, but you're not sure on a daily basis that he exists. Am I correct? Did I understand well?
The evidence of history and nature would suggest that if there is a God, he or she is not benevolent. And it seems to me that one of the things that I believe about God is if he or she exists, he or she is so other than what we are and so much larger than we are, that the whole question of the knowability of God is a very great perhaps. And it seems to me that the amount of suffering in the world would seem that it's a much more sensible option to assume that at least there's no personal God. So therefore, my intuition that there might be has to make me feel very, very foolish a great deal of the time.
Can I ask what you think?
Well, I would say.
Maybe you take it closer.
Is that?
Yeah.
Well, I would certainly say I believe. What would a life of disbelief would be about? In fact, I said to Antonio when he first asked me that question of faith, I never thought about it. I never thought about faith. It was not something I ever reflected upon until that question came. But quite simply, yes, I think we are implicated in belief even before we come to the intellectual question of whether we believe or not, which is quite superficial, because we behave, no matter what we say, in a way that proves that we believe. We can walk, we are tied to our sight, we have a connection to the world that is absolute, not relative. And so there's no question for me that belief is absolute, and not only through opinion, but kind of through evidence, despite all the evidence against it, despite all the denials. And perhaps my parents were the best examples. They were both Holocaust survivors, and they were really, really unbelievers. They were atheists in a very powerful way. They denied the existence of God, but their behavior was completely religious in every sense of the word. And so, yes, I would say through my background, through my Jewish traditions, there is no doubt that I believe, which is not associated with orthodoxy, not associated with any established rituals that make religion into an object. And surely, God is a non-existent reality, but it's a reality, non-existent in the sense that it's not an object in the world. It's just not one more thing to deal with.
Jonathan.
Yeah,
maybe.
Can you
You
hear?
can
This feels so dainty, holding a microphone like this. I feel like I haven't. I feel as agnostic about the question as I do about its answer. I mean, I'm not even sure one can ask the question in a way that can make sense and that two people can have a conversation over, because the words are so loaded, they're so ambiguous, they mean different things, entirely different things to different people. One person can say he doesn't believe when it would appear to somebody else as if he does. Another person can say the opposite, and the opposite observation can be made. And also within each of us, I think the words have very, very little meaning, or at least the meaning is fluid. It's like when people try to talk about wine, they start to sound really foolish very quickly, because there's something about wine that is inherently difficult to talk about. We know why that is. Science has told us why that is, not religion. Science has told us that the part of the brain that processes smell and taste is very far from the part of the brain that forms speech. Whereas eyesight is quite close to speech. So if you hold up an orange, anybody can describe very, very easily what the orange looks like, but it's impossible to describe what the orange smells like. I think the part of our brains, and I do think it's a part of our brains that confronts questions of faith, is very far from the verbal part of our brains. And I know that whenever I approach the question, I always stop before I get started, because even when I am posing the question to myself, I don't know what I mean. So, I mean, certainly I could tell you that, here's how I might possibly define it. This is something that I could conceivably say I believe in. My guess is that would sound to you like I was answering a question you didn't ask. Like I was talking about my wonder at, the size of things, the largeness or smallness or unlikelihood of things, which is very different than what, say, Mike Huckabee is talking about, whatever he's talking about. So I guess to me it's almost a linguistic problem as much as it is a conceptual problem.
I would like to ask the same question to Talese.
Let me.
Can we have
Come back to me later.
We can wait.
In all my years, I'm 75, and these things never worked. When I was in high school, they didn't work. They don't work at Temple Emanu-El. And let's see. Is it working now?
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be heard. I hope I can be heard now for another 2 minutes. My definition of religion, I think, was shaped by George Eliot in Middlemarch. And she defined, paraphrasing, that religion is a fear of the hereafter. And I grew up in a religiosity of fear. As a Roman Catholic, I was born in 1932, reared in the early 1940s as an altar boy in a small town. And the religion then, to me, and remains joyless. It was a joyless religion. I'm not speaking for Mary Gordon, obviously. I'm not speaking for many people, probably anybody, except myself. But I grew up dreading the hereafter, dreading the idea of violating the code of the church, being a sinner, damned forever, if not in purgatory, worse than that. And I never had a comfortable sense of self within religion. The only thing I got out of my Catholicism was a fear of being wrong as a writer. I'm a nonfiction writer, and from the time I was a schoolboy reporter in my small town weekly and high school paper, I had a fear of being found out and being inaccurate or being unfair, but mostly being careless. The great teacher of my career was the founder, or not the founder, but the man who created the New York Times as a great institution it is. His name is Adolph Ochs. He died in 1935, but he lives on with old people like me who graduated from the times in the spirit of Ox. And Mr. Ox's credo was we should be more than fair with those with whom we sincerely disagree. More than fair with those with whom we sincerely disagree. I have had that attitude throughout my life. It isn't associated with anything vaguely religious, but to me it is what I do believe holds values that are at least on the level of any religiosity that's been inculcated in my life as a young man and now as a man who must think about the hereafter. My wife and I recently attended one of many funerals we've attended the last 2 years, many funerals. And as we were coming from uptown, in a cab, we asked one another, do we wish to have a church burial? And both of us thought no. Is it over for us? In an unceremonious way, probably. Do I care? Not very much. Thank you.
I know you were not speaking for me, but being myself a Roman Catholic, I have a different approach. Okay? I see religion as a joyful experience, and it has to do with grace, and of course, trying to be a good Catholic. I see death as, actually, I see life as a passage, not the entire experience. I noticed before the rabbi mentioning people believing more in Mercedes-Benz than in God. And I remember a line from Woody Allen. It's a good joke, I think. He used to say that his parents believe in God and carpeting. And my question is, if you read the Bible, you don't find atheists. They are either believers or idol worshippers. So my point is, if you don't believe, do you think that it's possible not to become an idol worshipper? And when I say idol, I mean career, power, money, sex, our body. What do you think, Mary?
Well, can everybody hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
It's better now, isn't it? Yeah.
You can hear me? What?
Talk to the audience. This is
Okay.
what I say.
In other words, when I talk to a human being up here, you don't hear me.
Okay.
Okay, I'll focus. I think it's very interesting that in the early church, idolatry was considered the root of all sin, and I think that's a very good question, because why was idolatry such a danger, and why is it such a danger in monotheistic religions? On the other hand, the fear of idolatry has caused a lot of harm. That is to say, the iconoclasts, for example, who were so afraid, and the sort of very low church Presbyterians who were terrified of idolatry, were terrified by the power of beauty, by the power of imagery. So I think that the tension between idolatry and iconoclasm is a real problem for the religious imagination. And I also think one of the things that is a real danger for people of faith and people who are not of faith is the worship of the self. And I think the worship of, what do we mean by worship? We mean to bend the knee to say I am in an obeisant position. Well, what do you say is greater than yourself? And it seems to me that the most important aspect of belief is to understand a kind of mystery, a sense that you don't know everything, to be humble about that, and to put yourself in some sort of unstable relationship to the unknown. That seems to me to be able to endure the instability of the limitation of human understanding is to be essentially a religious person. But I want to respond to something that Gay said, and one of the other idolatries that religious people are susceptible to is privatism. One learns to be religious, as Daniel said, through religious people. So if you met a lot of mean, crabby priests and nuns who told you were going to go to hell, you would probably think Catholicism was a pretty joyous religion. So if you happened to meet Pope Pius XII, you would probably look for the exit sign if you had any brains. On the other hand, if you met John the 23rd or Oscar Romero, you might think Catholicism was something quite other. And so I think we have to also understand that religious life is not lived in rooms where one person tries to figure out who God is. We live it as a lived life in a community, learning from other people who live a larger life because they live religiously. Jesus said, I have come that you have life and have it more abundantly. And if religion makes any sense, it's about a more abundant life. If it's making you frightened and guilty, it is not religion, but a kind of idolatry. And it's an idolatry that idolizes fear because fear is safer than hope.
Well, I think it's certainly true. I think the 20th century and some of the 21st, we can see Hitler, we can see Stalin, we can see Mao Zedong, we can see what it means to produce a god out of a human being. We can see the disastrous results of it. So idolatry is not something abstract. You don't have to just read about the golden calf in the biblical text. It's very clear that through the Talmudic traditions to other traditions, the notion that religion is only, that faith is only a freedom from this or that, and that is not true. It's freedom for something, not just from something, but for something. Otherwise, we would be doomed to be subject to other men. So I think we often think that tradition is something very mild, but in fact, the radicalism of tradition is that it is a rebellion against the forgetting of tradition. It has that flame of the impossible, and I agree that it's, and I also agree that it's nothing that can be so easily put into words without understanding that it's a historical symbolism. It's not just something that we can banter about. We have to understand where does this God come from, and without understanding the tradition, we would be only sort of flipping a coin. But certainly it is true that to me personally, the problem of faith, of belief in God, is not a collective problem. It's an individual confrontation because we cannot share our lives. In some deeper level, we die alone. We don't die collectively. And I think the fact that we're supported by a bridge that itself has no support is the dilemma, the mystery, and also ultimate clarity, to me at least, of what it means to believe. And again, religion itself can certainly become idolatrous. You know, you can venerate the garments, the visual props of belief, and that's been very interesting because even in the biblical text, there are, you know, in the Bible we assume there's no images, but certainly when you look at the Hebrew text, there are images in the temple. You know, there are images, and we don't exactly know what they were, but they are.
Thank you. Jonathan first?
I don't know that I have so much to add. Can you hear?
Yes.
It's really hard not to address visually the person that I'm addressing my comments to, but I think, I mean, just to return to what I was saying before, I think there's a real dissonance between what we think we believe, how we act, and, you know, and this notion of false idols or creating idols or idol worship. One thing that's always struck me as really interesting and difficult to explain is the almost complete absence of great Jewish visual artists in the 20th century. I mean, you could count the examples probably on one hand, whereas there were so many great Jewish writers in the 20th century. And if you were to ask the individual artist, does this have anything to do with an anxiety about the prohibition against creating idols or graven images? I would imagine they would all say no, or at least most of them would. But to me, at least, it's the only explanation that I've been able to come up with. And to me, this is where religion is most interesting, is when it acts against your best wishes or your notions of yourself. Like, for example, I really like to think of myself as somebody who is who would answer the question, do you believe, negatively. That's the person I aspire to be, I have to say. And yet, when I went to get my driver's license renewed just a couple of weeks ago, they asked me to fill in the organ donation business. And it's something I've always been uncomfortable with, even though every single cell in my body knows that you have to sign on the line. It is positively the right thing to do, and there's simply no counter-argument. It is the ethical, upright thing to do. And so I did it. And my driver's license came in the mail, and in a different color font, large and offset, it says organ donor, bigger than my name. And I found it so upsetting. I just wish they could have, put it on the back or made it a little bit smaller. Why do I find it so upsetting? I find it so upsetting because I can't let go of the idea that I need to be buried in a certain kind of coffin, in a certain kind of cemetery, next to certain people. Mary and I were talking backstage about, I doubt you can find an atheist who is indifferent to the fate of his parents' body after they pass away. Nobody wants to see his mother's body defaced, kicked, spit upon, even if we know that it makes absolutely, or even if we say that it makes absolutely no difference. So where it's exciting for me and where it's useful in art, and I have to say that's the way I approach these questions most often and directly, is in how it influences our behavior against our best wishes, or against the portraits we've created of ourselves.
Ask me a different question. I think the gas is out on this subject, but
Do you mind if I first comment
Go
on
ahead.
something that Mary Gordon said? I like what you say about mystery. The point is, however, if we believe in a God who gives us commandments, show himself, and is there in every moment of our life. The second thing is, I'm Catholic, as I said, and I'm a huge fan of John the 23rd. However, I believe that every religion has his heroes and his, I don't know how to define, problematic persons. In particular, regarding Catholicism, I would like to read a brief quote from a Catholic author that I like, G.K. Chesterton. And this is what he says in his book Heretics, that I strongly recommend. It's a wonderful book. When Christ, at a symbolic moment, was establishing his great society, he chose for its cornerstone neither the brilliant Paul nor the mystic John, but a shuffler, a snob, a coward, in a word, a man. And upon his rock he has built his church, and the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. All the empires and the kingdoms have failed because of this inherent and continual weakness, that they were founded by strong men and upon strong men. But this one thing, the historic Christian church, was founded on a weak man, and for that reason it is indestructible. For no chain is stronger than its weakest link. Of course, Chesterton is a believer, but I have problems in separating, when we talk about the religion, the good guys from the bad guys. Not because I don't think there were a lot of bad guys, but I see the entire vision of a church, of a religion. I want to go back now to Gay Talese. Why don't you tell me something about, I was fascinated by you, seeing you as an altar boy, your relationship with your parents in terms of religion.
I grew up embarrassed at seeing my father kneeling through much of the morning praying to a saint in southern Italy who levitated. His name is St. Francis de Paolo. Hemingway knew him. He's well known in Cuba. there's a great cathedral in Naples, St. Francis de Paula.
They'd be.
And he was born and reared in the part of southern Italy, Calabria, is the southern tip of the boot, not far from my father's village. My father was an immigrant, a tailor, came to America in 1920, he thought, under the auspices of St. Francis de Paula. And throughout his life in America, he prayed every day. When I went to parochial school in the 1930s, I would come back embarrassed to find my father on his knees, praying to this medieval saint. I later on, in the 1950s, I was in the army in Germany, and I visited for the first time this village that produced my father and his spirit, dominated by this aforementioned saint. And I saw great poverty, and I saw great belief. I saw a lack of industriousness, a lack of entrepreneurial spirit, but belief in the hereafter and the saint that would cure all ills, including if one visited the cathedral in this town, in the nearby town, you'd find the walls of the place. Affixed to the walls were crutches, braces, all of the functional devices that people who were once ill now hung as reminders of that lost illness. They were cured. This kind of faith, this kind of belief transcended anything that medicine then and now could promise. So I had a sense of faith and a sense of mixed feelings about a father genuflecting through the morning, praying to this mystical man, dead 500 years ago. As a journalist, as a writer, I've always been skeptical. I grew up that way and was healthy in my profession when I was a young man, not to believe unless you saw it, and never to take more than one, just to one source. I always had doubt. I thought doubt was healthy. As an older person in the 1960s, when I certainly became skeptical, I saw churches and gatherings such as of largely like-minded people, congregations, be they Catholic, be they Jewish, be they Protestant, were not, in my mind, calling into question the righteousness of our government. I saw churches as infused with a sense of nationalistic spirit that made them harmonious and perhaps at home with their nation on foreign policy, but rarely during that period, the 1960s, did I see the church stand up, my church or other people's churches stand up and question the right to kill strangers. I see that now. I do not see ministers and priests and rabbis calling into question the righteousness or the lack of aforethought with regard to killing, invading, meddling in foreign people's affairs. Across the street, as I was walking here tonight, there's a building that I think used to be part of the property of Temple Emanu-El. I might be wrong, but chalked in the stone across the street, love thy neighbor as love thyself. There it is. It's right in the stone. It's now an apartment house, I gather, and I asked the doorman, who put that up there? And he didn't know. And here I am. But love thy neighbor, is that really what the churches are doing? Do we love our neighbor? Well, is that the mission of tonight? No, we're asking questions. But I ask questions, and it isn't going to be answered here, nor is it going to be answered by Chesterton or perhaps by the scholars in residence here. It is just that I've had, unlike my father, I've had a history of wondering, do these people to whom we are to pay attention because they rise above us in righteousness, do I really believe that are they other than influenced by their time or by their nation or by the politics that's so much a part of churches? It's almost as if there's a trade-off between not paying taxes and not raising hell in times of war. I don't see in the churches the voice of dissent. I don't see anywhere today, very much, a voice of dissent, questioning what this country is doing. This is not the purpose of the evening. I'm well aware of that. We're supposed to deal on a higher plane, spiritual belief. But I am telling you that I have misgivings so much about the purpose and the fulfillment of religion. So I speak to you as probably one of the unattractive characters up here, but thank you.
You like to?
I would just like to say in the 1960s, there were probably at least as many religious people protesting the war in Vietnam as there were in the New York Times. If you remember, it took the New York Times a really long time to get on the bandwagon that the Vietnam War was not a great thing, and they don't have such a wonderful track record in Iraq. So if we're going to talk about institutions that one might be idolatrous about, I have a lot more faith in a Neapolitan that flies than I do in the New York Times. Because I think it's easier to say, I don't think that guy is flying. I think that's probably not happening. Whereas the New York Times, and I would say all post-Enlightenment people who really are confident in their own ability to know, the New York Times is responsible for a lot of error. It questions itself very, very little. It has not been. Look at the New York Times. The New York Times was silent about the Holocaust for a very long time. The New York Times did not have a great track record in the 30s and 40s. The New York Times, which was run by Jews, did not have a very good history of standing up for Jews and pointing out the horrors that it should have been seeing. If you want to talk about the 1960s, talk about Daniel Berrigan, talk about Martin Luther King, talk about all the nuns that were talk about Abraham Joshua Heschel. It seems to me that you will get at least as much dissent from the progressive wings of churches as you will from the New York Times and certainly from Goldman Sachs. And so, so I think that this notion that, first of all, I think it's a mistake to assume that religious people are somehow free from sin. They're not. They're human beings. They are usually no better or no worse than any other group of people. They're no better or no worse than academics, politicians, artists, writers. They're human beings. Some of them are courageous, some of them are not. But to assume that all the churches in the whole world are complicit in the atrocities of the world and are silent, I think is a little bit crude. And I think that the history of all human institutions is a bad history. Whatever human beings touch, they tend to corrupt.
That's too pessimistic.
You want to continue? Or?
No, I think it's interesting that in the modern age, we think that faith is dependent on human beings. But faith is not completely dependent on us, what we decide, what we believe. We are not the only element in the partnership with the world. So it's interesting that we think that we can choose to be faithful or not faithful, to believe or not to believe. But the world is in tension. There is a chaos. There is a longing. There is a disappointment. There is a alienation. There is a love. And all those elements are somehow related to something which we grasp at, and as you said, with a deep uncertainty. But I think the flattening of spirituality to a sort of what do I feel? Do I feel good about it? Do I feel bad about it? Is a true banalization of the history of the fact that it is actually a history of spirituality. I'm an architect. And probably the greatest proof of the belief is architecture, because nothing would have ever been built if it was not for God, or call it any name, for the beyond, for the mysterious. There wouldn't be, people lived in temporary, vulnerable lodgings. They only built eternity into something that could, for them, presume to withstand time. The Jews built eternity into buildings that are not even built of stone, into texts, into longings that are inscribed in even more powerful foundations than what is built with material reality. So it's certainly interesting to follow just from the environment that we've inherited over thousands of years. What are we part of, or are we just recreating reality in our own image. And by the way, I think it was very interesting what you said, Jonathan. There are, I think, great Jewish artists. Their work perhaps was not accepted. They came from a tradition that didn't do the same things. But one can simply mention somebody like Chagall, somebody like Soutine, someone like El Libeskind, someone like Eric Mendelssohn, great revolutionary artists who have perhaps more influence today and tomorrow than the so-called famous artists, of any of the isms. So again, it's a very complex world we are discussing, and I agree. But I don't think we can simply vote yes or no. It's not a referendum, and it never was and never will be.
Might I ask a question, Jonathan? Is it possible, he mentions the great wealth in the 20th century of the Jewish writers, by which I mean American Jewish writers, you mean as well as any other. Mm-hmm. Could it be that this is true because Jewish people are outsiders no matter where they go, and as outsiders they have a perspective, a point of view, a distance which they wish to bridge in their writing to communicate their position? And if that's true, and it may not be true, why is it possible, why is it likely that the artist, that the image maker is not as much of an outsider? Is it because you need to be commissioned? Tell me about that economically.
Well, a writer travels with his goods, and an artist can't as simply. I mean, that's the most straightforward way of talking about what you raised. But also, what I didn't mention is Jews are considered people of books, and right. that is the tradition. And Jewish homes tend to be decorated with books rather than paintings, and I imagine that's been true forever.
And it's not true, if I may interrupt, the Italians are people. The reverse is true. We have painters from the time of the church's supported painting, and you do not find Italian-American writers. We have a little bit of Mary Gordon in us, but there are not Italian-American writers, and there's this abundance of Jewish writers, American Jewish writers, because we Italians do not want to tell secrets. There is that kind of insularity. Being all of us from small villages, mainly the Italian came, I see somebody knows what I'm talking about over there, Mr. Siegel, formerly New York Times, you published my essay, about the Italians being interior people, insular people, mostly from the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, the area of southern Italy. And they do not want to tell stories that embarrass the family. So this is closed up. Omerta is a way to describe it. We don't have any, but we have a lot of painters. In this case, the Jewish literary tradition in this country is stronger than any other. From young people, your generation, to old people, Philip Roth, and much older than that. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I mean, the artists you gave are perfect examples and would be in that one hand that I was describing. I mean, I didn't mean to say that there weren't any. I just mean to say there's this obvious disparity between writing, which is something that does have a sort of secretive aspect to the more performative, to the thing, the physical object that you create and that is looked at by yourself and others.
But even the text, you gave an example of Jewish books, but the text itself is not just an abstraction. It is also a work of art. It is a creative act. The writing is not only an abstract piece of communication, it also has its own beauty. It also has its own figurative beauty as a work of art. And I think many of what we consider decorative works of art in Jewish tradition are actually great works of art. It's just that the market hasn't been developed for them. They are not like, an ism, and they don't fit into that market. And that's perhaps also why Jewish art seems not to have existed in history. But it's certainly true that it has existed from the very beginning. And you can see it in the amount of writing devoted to architecture, for example, in the biblical literature. Chapters and chapters on the temple, chapters on the tabernacle, whole chapters on detailing of, of every single thing. I don't know any other text of any other religious kind that goes into such detailed analysis of, size, proportion, connection. So again, I think we often sort of just say, Jews didn't, are people of the book, which in some ways is a cliche. They are much more like other people, deeply involved in the world.
Can I ask what you think about the relationship between religion and art? Do you see religion as an inspiration or a limitation for an artist?
I think you couldn't build a building if you didn't believe. You'd be just putting bricks and steel. What could you do if you didn't believe? What would anything mean in the world? What would the murder of 6 million Jews mean if it didn't mean anything? If there was no spiritual value to it? It would be just a statistic. It would be just nothing. So there is meaning. Without meaning, you couldn't build a building. And I think it is certainly acknowledged by the great artists, whether Mies van der Rohe, who had, copy of St. Augustine on his desk, or whether it's Le Corbusier, who was, again, a heretical religious practitioner with inscription of all his beliefs in his buildings. I don't think you could, at least from my own point of view, I'm not a historian and I don't know much about it, but certainly from the point of view of making something without belief, it would be just a hollow exercise, and it wouldn't stand up.
I think that's unfair to the great atheist artists.
They believe. They're great believers in the non-existence of God.
Well, I think that for some people, like Picasso, he rejected religion.
He believed in the Communist Party.
Well, all right, but then I could believe in that the number 4 bus is going to happen. It's not.
That's fine. It's just called a limited belief.
But I think if we're talking about belief in the sense that we have to honor the fact that many of the great artists of the 20th century were not believers, such as Samuel Beckett, for example, who's a very, very great artist and was not a believer. George Eliot, for example, had a terrible crisis of faith. She began as a believer. She then translated Strauss's Life of Jesus, lost her faith, confronted her father, lost everything, gave up everything in her life for her atheism, had a vision that was intensely moral, intensely connected human beings. I think that we have to honor people who say that there is meaning in our aliveness in the here and now. They believe in our connectedness as human beings. They might believe in the grandeur of nature. But to say that they are believers in the sense that we mean, I wouldn't agree with that.
What would those people say about the Holocaust? The people you just mentioned?
They would say that all human beings, they would say that it was a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was humiliated. There was a culture of anti-Semitism historically, that human beings need to create an other, that human beings need to create a scapegoat, and that, how do you say the Holocaust has meaning? That's what I don't understand.
Well, Adorno said exactly the opposite, that if you think that a Holocaust can be explained by statistical and objective facts, you yourself are using the same thinking that created the Holocaust. That was a very radical statement of Adorno. He was a radical philosopher. Don't blame me for his thoughts.
But if you say that the Holocaust has meaning because God intended it, that seems heinous to me as well.
No, that's not what I say. But you can read what Elie Wiesel says, who himself experienced the horrors of horrors, and yet is not someone who is an atheist. Interesting.
If I did understand what you mean, Daniel, the point is being a believer is different from being a religious person.
Yes.
The difference is also between a man who is an atheist and a man or a woman who is a nihilist. You can be a great artist without being religious, no doubt about it. It's probably more difficult if you're a nihilist. Can we agree on this?
One of the problems here is we can't hear one another. I'll tell you, I didn't hear what you said. Did you hear?
Some.
We're having, sorry audience, we're
I would just, I think this is coming back. I think that you two are talking about different kinds of belief and different kinds of faith. Clearly, if you're saying, your examples of modern, the unavoidable, inevitable belief of taking the next step without having to analyze the situation physically, that's not the kind of belief that I'm talking about. I don't think it's the kind of belief that Mary's talking about. John Ashbery wrote a really wonderful essay about avant-garde art, and he takes Jackson Pollock as his example of an avant-garde artist, and he says that when he was first making those paintings, before they'd been celebrated, before he was on the cover of whatever it was, Life magazine, called The Greatest American Painter, he had to wonder if he wasn't the worst American painter, if there was the possibility that he was not kind of wrong, but entirely wrong. In fact, the only options were that he was the greatest painter or the worst painter. It was inconceivable that the maker of those drip paintings was a mediocre painter. And that leap of faith is something that the viewer of his paintings has to take as well. I mean, I don't believe anybody who would say that they never wondered looking at a Pollock if it wasn't crap. At least the first few times. It's a kind of it's a knee-jerk reaction that's impossible to ignore. And what Ashbery goes on to say is there's a real analogy to religion here. And if God were to reveal himself or herself, of course everybody would believe whatever that means. Everybody would go to a church or synagogue and get on the knees and pray if that's what God asked of us. But everything that's interesting and beautiful about religion would be lost, because the thing that makes religion religion is the all-or-nothing wager. And when you talk about an artist needing belief, I think what you're talking about is an artist being willing to embark on that all-or-nothing wager, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with God or religiosity, but the willingness to need to be entirely right or entirely wrong. That's what inspires great buildings. That's what inspires great books and great paintings. And it's to me entirely separate from the kind of faith that I think your book is about.
You're not believers. You think that this person is, I don't know.
I feel threatened.
Threatened?
I feel that because belief is rarely private, that the believer wishes to have it known that she is a believer with some sense of direction and value, and the right to disseminate, the right to extend the influence of that inner belief. It becomes perilous for those who have doubt, or those of us who might have a different version of what is righteous or virtuous.
Can I interrupt
So
you for a
religion is dangerous as it is divine, and that's which is which, when.
St. Augustine, when he wrote his confession, said, I'm scared by the gospel. So I take this as a great compliment, actually.
It's good company for me.
Jonathan, what about you?
It's actually rare that I meet a religious person, I have to admit. It's like when I meet...
You have at least one on this stage.
Right. It's like meeting an older virgin. That's the analogy I can think of. Like, how did you last so long like that in this world? What's it like? Don't you, to me, it's something that I've become extremely curious about. I find myself asking lots of questions. I don't feel threatened in the slightest. This is like an echo of the reaction that I had when my license came in the mail, but I have this longing to be a little bit more like that person, even though I don't want to be. The 99.9% of me that guides my decision-making in my life has no desire to be like that, but there is something in me that I can't quite give up. I mean, my relationship to religion is something that I can't quite give up, or to faith, it's something I can't quite give up, which I think has to do with the poem that you read. There's a space that is inside of me that I don't value, but I'm aware of.
Mary? And then, what do you think?
Well, I am a person of faith, and I actually, having been away from the Catholic Church for about 20 years, I come back to it. I belong to a parish. I am I would say, a dissident, left-wing, enraged Catholic, furious at the hierarchy about 23 and a half hours out of 24. but I believe that there is a way of being in the world that a certain kind of Catholicism embodies, which is a belief in something larger than oneself, an ability to give more than one ought to be able to give. Also, there is the history, the cultural history of the Catholic Church that's very dear to me. I like it that I can go into a church in Rome, and the fact that the Filipina cleaning woman next to me and the senator and the African chieftain and I can all say, Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, or Lord have mercy, and we all say the same thing. And that's of value to me. When I go to church, I'm with people I would never talk to at Columbia University or in the literary world. I really have something to say to people who are very different from me in class and race and background. And for that 1 hour, we all wish for the same thing, which may or may not have the virtue of existing. And so to me, it's very valuable. I understand that when I tell people I go to church, they take 90 IQ points off me. And so I have to experience it from the other side.
No, I think we too often, in my view, associate, let's say, being Jewish with going to a synagogue, with a kind of certain kind of orthodoxy. But, if you really take Jewish traditions, they are very, very complicated. They range, on one hand, I'm talking about my own family, anarchists, social democrats, Zionists, mystics, Chassids. So you cannot say one of those is the Jewish, it's the entire range of intellect, emotion that creates what I would call the continuity. And I think each culture has this continuity. I think it's not by coincidence that, for example, my tradition has lasted for such a long time, despite, the odds that such a belief would be sort of something that would last more than just a couple of years, believing in the things that are inscribed in the Jewish soul. So I disagree with you that an artist is working for himself, making a bet, am I going to get to the museum or not, or am I not going to get? I'm deeply convinced that whatever John Ashbery has written, Jackson Pollock is a mystical Jewish author of a text that is very complex, that is emblematic, and that is deep, and that will outlast the critics. There's no doubt in my mind. So I don't think we can reduce it to just an ego. And it's interesting, the world, as I said, calling oneself an atheist, and my parents probably would turn in their grave if they heard me speaking today, because they were so against the synagogue. They were so bleak about religion. They disbelieved. They probably would think they produced a monster. But, it's interesting because I never went to the synagogue. I'm not a synagogue, and yet my kids living in different places, one in Israel, one in Europe, have sort of converted themselves. They became far more religious than I would ever thought that my children would become. And I don't know, you cannot attribute it simply the change of climate, the change of, whatever, Islam. What you can, it's something that is wondrous. And I think this wonder is something questionable. And I think we didn't give enough credit to religion. That religion itself created the possibility of doubt. The religion itself created the possibility of rebellion. We would never have had a rebellion, a revolution, without religion.
Can I ask you a question? What would your response be if they said, I'm becoming very deeply involved in Catholicism for beginners, and then if they said Rastafarianism or something that's maybe a slightly further afield, speaking in this particular context?
I think it'd be very weird, but they haven't said it to me. Thank God.
Will they reply?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I'm just trying to suss out, because I still don't necessarily, I think we might still be seeing eye to eye on what I was speaking about with the all or nothing wager, because I don't think you're talking about faith or religion in the same ways that the other panelists are. And I think clearly, your notion of these things is very, very bound up with history, as is mine, with culture, with continuity. And the reason I ask the question is to try to find out to what extent those things really do determine your notion of faith. You know,
Can
if
I
you're,
try to answer? And there is something also for you. I like what you said about doubt. But first, I don't think all the religion can admit doubt. Do you think that in Iran today, would you be free to say, I doubt what Allah is telling me?
I don't know.
Definitely you can say this here. You can say it in Rome.
I think that there are certain, I think that there are certain strains in Islamic thought, and I know some Muslim thinkers who can certainly, who do doubt and do
I don't
question.
deny this, but you know the first line of the Quran is, this is the book without doubts. It's the first line.
Well, all of us have lines in our sacred texts that are problematic.
No, my point is that not all the religions are the same. So Rastafarian, with all due respect, is not exactly what I think is a serious religion.
There's a couple of Rastafarians up there. Why don't you ask some questions?
It's time for questions now.
Lady with a hat.
Maybe, is there a mic or there is a gentleman here?
I just wanted to say that I think you were speaking about such a large subject, and it really needed some definition in terms. Like, for instance, the word religion could have a meaning unto itself for agnostics, for non-believers, for believers of whatever the religion is, and then faith unto itself could have a totally different ocean of answers unto itself, and then relate the parts to each other. And what has been done is just giving tidbits here and there, and I didn't find any unifying information other than your wonderful personal experiences. So it would be nice that you would be able to define, each of you, what like religion is and what faith is unto itself, and then integrate those thoughts.
Of course, I can speak only for myself. Religion comes from a Latin word, religio, which means bond, tie. Therefore, I think that a religious man is tied with God's word. I am Christian, so for me religion is a meeting with Christ, and I believe in what Christ says. I cannot respond for them, but this is what religion is. Tie, bond. I also want to add that for me religion is orthodoxy, which is very different from fundamentalism. Actually, it's quite the opposite, because the way I see orthodoxy is a way of sharing a gift, while fundamentalism is an attempt to keep people who are not sharing this gift away. In other words, one is a positive, inclusive attitude, the other one is an exclusive attitude. And to conclude this, my feeling is that nowadays religion should fear two problems, two dangers. The first one is fundamentalism, any kind of fundamentalism. And the second one is what I call the New Age kind of approach to religion, where anyone decides what he or she likes about a particular religion, refusing the rest. I don't know if you want to respond or add.
Well, I'm the bad Catholic and he's the good Catholic. But it's affected me possibly because of my age. I grew up in a Catholicism perhaps that was very different from what the younger Antonio Monda knew and believed. I believed what I saw, and what I saw as a young man in the 1940s in the Catholic Church was a class system. A class system. The church of my time, of my youth, was dominated by the Irish American clergy, the bishops, the monsignors, and the priests, and the nuns were, with few exceptions, Irish. And there were many churches in my youth in which the Italians had to stay in the back. One doesn't recall that unless you're my age and have experience similar to mine. But there was this class system within the Catholic Church in this country, largely an immigrant church, with most stalwart members being Irish, and the others, Italians, being of a lower class, not having the language, not having perhaps the capacity to assimilate in one generation as the Irish, having the language, could. So I grew up with that kind of class Catholicism. And it's not something that I forgave ever. I'm not saying that I'm a vengeful person or my personality is afflicted into vengefulness in any way. It's just that I saw the church as hypocritical then, and I later on, when I married, I did marry in the church. I married a Catholic woman, but I went to Rome and married outside the church. Never, I had a civil ceremony in Rome, of all places. It was in 1959. I'll soon be 50 years married to the same woman outside the church, having been married in Rome. So that says something. I don't know what.
Can we take
Jonathan.
a couple of other questions? Or do we have time? 2 questions, maybe? Yeah?
Hi, I have a question.
I don't see you, though.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question for you, Antonio, the man who's been putting all the questions to everybody else. Before I buy your book, and I think it's a wonderful idea.
Thank you.
I think your book is a wonderful idea, but before I buy it, I'd like to ask you a few questions about what was your purpose in writing a book like this, and how did you decide whom to interview? I don't know if the panelists here are representative of the people that you have interviewed in the book, but they are a range of people within the New York intellectual literary circle. I'd be interested to know if you had spoken, what kind of answers you might have gotten. Had you spoken to Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, people not within the framework of Christianity and Judaism? I hope you did speak to some Protestants, even some fundamentalists. But I'd be interested in learning a little bit more about how you decided to interview the people you decided to interview, and what the range is.
Okay, thank
And
you.
what kind of questions you decided to pose. Did you ask the same questions to everybody?
Okay,
Thank you.
first of all, thank you. The book is a collection of 18 interviews with major American personalities or living in America. As I said, I started with a collection of 5 interviews for La Repubblica. And at the beginning, I wanted to interview only writers. So I started with Saul Bellow, Toni Morrison, and all the others. I tried to interview not only Christian and Jews, but also, for example, Salman Rushdie is, among the writers who participated. I tried to interview Muhammad Ali, but as you know, he's very ill, so it was not possible. There are several atheists and agnostics in the book. There are both women and men in the book. And if you do a little poll, only 40% of them are believers. To answer the second part of the question, why? I think it's the fundamental question. I go back to the very beginning of this meeting. If I do believe in God, and I do believe in a religion, everything else is consequential. This is what I do believe. God is not an argument, is not a theme, is not an issue. It's something or someone who gives shape to everything you do. So I start posing this question, and it's very simple. I ask, do you believe? Do you pray? Do you imagine God? For example, I have a couple surprising answers. Derek Walcott, wonderful poet from the Caribbean, a black man, imagined God as a white, old, bearded man, like, the Sistine Chapel God. Michael Cunningham defined God as a black woman. And I can tell you different answers about this image of God. It's a very simple book, or at least it tries to approach fundamental question in a simple way.
Thank you.
I'm
Only one question.
okay. I wish we'd have had in the audience today to ask more questions Spinoza, and on the other hand, I wish we'd have had Albert Einstein. We all know about Spinoza's questions about the nature of God. But interestingly enough, Einstein might have given him an answer. When he was asked if he believes in God, he says he believes in order. And
He believes in
order.
Yes.
And it's interesting that a scientist, of his caliber, believes in a certain existence of order. And in reality, when human beings, and maybe I'm being a Jew, maybe the Jewish tradition, when it introduces its concept of religion, introduces the concept of order. And we introduce God as the vehicle for order. We were sending him to Sinai, yes or no, it's not important. We recognize the weakness of human beings, and we gave him orders how to behave in this world. We also told him, and now we know that we're right, that having one God is one very important element. There is only one God. Problem is that once we had the concept of one God, we have now several gods, and each one is claiming to be a better one than the other, and the concept is not working out. We also introduced the concept of appreciation to nature. Don't forget who created heaven and earth, and we all know the beauty. All of which is really represented in the confusion that was shared here this evening. We talked about fear. We talked about appreciation. We talked about nature. All of this is a part of the religion, except it didn't work out because everybody has his own interpretation. So the sense of confusion is still human beings trying to deal with the concept of God, and the answers and the questions we have still remain to be the same for all these basic human attributes or weaknesses or whatever.
It seems to me more a comment than a question, but thank you. I like to remind another definition of Einstein. He used to say there are people who believes in everything and people who believes in nothing. So it's up to us.
Well, the caveat to your story is that this way of thinking made him irrelevant in the physics community as his life went on and as he aged. He said God doesn't play dice with the universe, and apparently God does. Or at least the best physical explanations we've been able to come up with suggest that things do happen unpredictably, randomly, in ways that defy logic. Now, some people say quantum physics is the ultimate proof that something very mysterious and inexplicable and, super logical is happening. But it was a shame. I would say that this particular stance that Einstein took, the idea that everything was ultimately going to be reducible to an elegant equation because God wouldn't create a world that wasn't elegant, really did make him sort of kitschy for the last decade or 2 decades of his life.
But isn't it also true that chaos is not in a contemporary science, chaos is not disorder. It's a form of much higher order than the order that was established prior to the new discoveries of scientists. Mm-hmm. And certainly no scientist would claim that they are working in a disordered way. They are ordered.
Well, this is a whole
It's a question of chaos. Yes. Yeah. Many things have been written about it.
Our universe came as a result of chaos, as a result of, an unusual happening.
I think it's time to leave. I would like to thank Jonathan, Safran, Foer, my friend, the Bad Catholic, Gay Talese, Daniel Libeskind, and of course Mary Gordon. Thank you.
Great hero, my little brother, who's an aspiring little girl. How little is he?